This image might be helpful to some of you in your fundamental relationship with God and with all reality, which in my understanding are the same. So, one of the favorite images of Scripture is the house of God. I'm sure if you've read the Bible, you know how much the temple in Jerusalem meant to people as a symbol of the presence of God in that nation, or Israel, which was a fundamental and somewhat primitive view of God. That is to say, you have to begin somewhere. And every prayer or every attention, even from the smallest child that God receives, he seems to be very appreciative of. So we can never exaggerate God's interest in us, caring, tenderness. Every human relationship that is beautiful and good and true is present in God in an eminent manner. So if you like, at certain points in your life, you may think of God as a parent, as a loving mama or papa. Or you may think of him as an older brother in the case of Jesus. Or might think of him as someone you want to be engaged to if you have enough romantic development. Or you want to think of God as a spouse. Or there are any other relationship. I'm sure God would be happy to relate to you as a CEO of your company, if you have one, or as a nurse, or as a doctor, as a lawyer, as a banker, all of these things. So God is everything in every way to us as an open relationship. And as our own spiritual experience unfolds through regular practice of contemplative prayer in some form, then one or other of these relationships becomes more attractive. And so it's a good idea to follow what you feel most comfortable about God. But the house of God refers to, obviously, a building. And the Psalms have many references to not only to the temple, but specifically to the house of God. The psalmist prays, if I could only live in the house of God all the days of my life, how happy I would be. Well, the house of God is really a metaphor of all creation. So now we're at a new phase of human life where we need to learn how to make the divine energies into pure love, mercy, forgiveness, and to bring creation to its highest expression, which is human life at the moment. Now maybe there are higher ones still to come, but we better first do our job in this one. So the house of God has certain characteristics. It doesn't have doors and windows. So there's nothing to lock, nothing to protect, nothing to defend. In fact, there are no walls either. There's no ceiling and there's no floor. It's just the house of God is just all space, and hence it's flexible and can do all kinds of things, including expanding, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So just to be born is to be in the house of God. And there was a certain point in Jewish history that's significant. When the temple was destroyed, what happened? The idea of God as in a building, as in temple, was evacuated, and the new idea of God, a much more mature and human way of relating to God, came into being, namely to see oneself as the temple of God, or to be aware that one's little house, us, is present in this enormous house. So we're just a little cubby hole in, in a creation, well, look at it. It's awesome. So we're not big, but we're extremely important because our capacity to manifest the spiritual aspects of God is something new, very recent, from the point of view of time in creation. So you can never get away from the presence of God. There's no use trying. But we don't think of God as present because this house is not in the realm of sense experience or temporal events. It just is. And nobody ever built it because it's always been there, because God is eternal. There's another symbol in Scripture that you might prefer. It has the same metaphorical point, and that is creation as the womb of God. So this has some appeal to many people today because it gives the feminine such a prominent place, which it should have always had. That needs to be developed a lot more. But so we're all together in a living body of people who are growing to a point where they can graduate from this particular house of God to the one that it is present as a kind of holon. In other words, this creation is like a box inside a box inside a box. Only it's not a box. It's this dynamic, living interactions of various forms of energy that has now produced a species that can evolve spiritually, that is to say, on different levels of consciousness, which makes it possible for us to hang on to God's becoming. And it enables God to manifest himself or to learn what it's like to be human, which is to have the lowest form of intelligence that's available at this point in creation. We're not big shots rationally, but it's an enormous growth over animal consciousness. It enables us to reflect, to be self-conscious, and to respond to the invitation of God, which has called us into being, to be a thou. In other words, God's idea, not ours, that brought us into this world, and it has the purpose of relating to us in the most profound possible degree. So in this perspective, the intriguing definition that Thomas Aquinas gave of a human soul is impressive. A human soul is, he says, a certain capacity for God. So it's not an infinite capacity, but obviously the best way to receive the divine life which is to be put into this capacity is to have nothing else in it. The emptier you are, the more of God you can receive. So emptiness is in the spiritual categories, and there's a lot of literature about this in all the traditions, of course, but emptiness is the dispossession of everything that we've acquired, including ourselves, so that God gives us this lifetime in which to gradually become a self consciousness and relate to God on the human level, and then to move on to let go of our attachments to our human self and to become divine. Now you'd think we'd like this. Have the freedom, the immensity, and the power of God. It sounds great to high achievers. But it's the wrong way to go. And what we've called original sin in the past is not so much a sin, but an unevolved state of consciousness in which we haven't stopped dealing with reality primarily out of animal instincts. In other words, it's quite, philosophers used to say humans are rational animals. Notice rational is only an adjective. The main thing that we still are is animals. So we're in this house of God then are all these creatures also growing to whatever their destiny is, so that for humans death is not the end of things, but is the birth canal into eternal life, into how to lead the divine life. And the way to lead it is to be dispossessed, at least interiorly willing to let go. And that's what poverty of spirit means. Not attached to any of our possessions, which sometimes requires real detachment from them. And this might be the reason why God continues to allow tragedies and wars and national disasters, because they're part of the evolutionary process that he started, that has spiritual communion and union with God and everything else in creation as its goal and purpose. So if you think of yourself in the house of God, or if you prefer a personal approach, as in a womb of God with the divine umbilical cord taking care of all your needs, it would be wonderful, as long as we didn't fight with each other. Now, it's never a good idea if a mother's having twins or triplets for them to get into a fight. It will be very uncomfortable. I don't have this experience, so I can't say how much. But we must give God acute indigestion at times from the way we proceed. And so it takes a lifetime of this incredible relationship in which God acts as psychotherapist and analyst and spiritual director and mother and father and spouse and friend and everything else, because we need all the love and attention we can get. So how to get in contact with this reality of the house that we're living in, or the motherly womb in which, with all of creatures, we're growing towards a greater life, a fuller life, the divine life. And this is all that religion is about. It's trying to get you interested or prepared in this project, or to have a peek into the divine plan that would be enough to interest us in the face of all the very real attractions and things we can possess in this world. Nothing wrong with them. It's our attitude that is the problem, to think that they can bring us happiness when this is only possible through communion with the ultimate reality, our source. So, one of the obstacles to becoming aware of this marvelous presence that is always there, you can't get away from, is always loving and present and relationship and ready to adjust to wherever we are in our spiritual journey, is not put off by our failures and sins and mistakes and stupidity. Because God knows we're just, as a species, gently trying to climb out of our animal ancestry and instinctual needs to a more mature way of living life and an openness to spiritual evolution. In fact, wasn't it Teilhard de Chardin that said that biological evolution for humans is pretty well complete? That is, there are enough people around. The earth has been filled, as Scripture recommended or commanded, depending on how you interpret it. But what hasn't been completed is of course enough people maturing on the levels of higher consciousness, that is, on the levels of participating in God's consciousness or cosmic consciousness, Christ consciousness. They're all stages that can be permanent states of consciousness if we pursue this relationship and allow the divine therapy to heal the obstacles in us, which are usually more or less pride. Perhaps the process for us, as Jesus said in one of his wisdom sayings, if you try to preserve your life, meaning the false self and the ego identity that you built up in the first half of life, if you want to do that, you will bring yourself to ruin. But anyone, so this is open to all, not on the basis of religion even, but it's the quality that's innate to human nature, which is the capacity to become God too, in virtue of Christ's incarnation. So we already have this capacity. It's a question of getting rid of what's the obstacles to realizing it. So so it's not so much an ascetical life that makes you a contemplative and sets you on the path of the divine transformation. It's your willingness to be yourself, whoever you are, with what's been given you, and to offer yourself to God just as you are. Sins are not a problem. Something is guiding this evolution. And at the moment, the biological evolution seems to complete, and to complete Teilhard's thought, what evolution is now focused on the development of human consciousness into more and more unified, relational, and divine capacities to perceive the mystery of God. So we need time for that, and we need a milieu in which we won't be overwhelmed by the divine presence too soon. And so one of the services of our faults or our weaknesses, which Paul says are almost infinite, is that it also hides from us the presence of God, because there's some, not in a good sense, but in a sense that it supports our realization that we're a creature, that we can't do it ourselves, that as the first step of AA puts it, our lives have become unmanageable. It doesn't have to be through some alcoholic or other addiction. There are plenty of other addictions. And just by being born, we're on the path to some addiction if we live long enough, unless we develop the non-possessive attitude and the relationship with God that is not codependent, but rightly dependent, because God happens to be the creator and it can't be changed. So if we can submit to that, and this is what some of the great mystics of our time are beginning to say, or beginning to be enlightened about, at least from my modest reading, which is limited to English. It's not sin that is the problem. Naturally, if this is working, you stop sinning because you start doing what is right spontaneously, because the Spirit within us is suggesting how to respond to every situation as a natural attitude, and as of someone who lives in the house of God or is growing up in the womb of God as mother. Someone wants the scriptural quote on that. There's several places where that idea is expressed in the Old Testament and in the New. But so what God asks of us then, the fundamental issue, is, won't you please accept being a creature? Because there's no other way we can relate. I created you. If you do that, which involves a sense of our nothingness without God, then all your personal history and all your accomplishments and all your failures are absorbed or immersed or extinguished in the reality of actually participating in God's life, which is the definition of grace. So that you will be looking out of God's eyes. You will be relating with God's love, heart to heart, with every creature, appropriately to their level of consciousness. And you will have those dispositions of forgiveness, compassion without limit, practical helping of others, concern, gentleness, incredible love, deeper than any passion can go. All this, God would give you everything, if we could just accept being nothing. Once you accept it, you don't have to think about it anymore. But you do really have to accept it, and that, at least up until this point in human evolution, has required trials, difficulties, disasters, dark nights, disappointments, and death. All of them are not there for their own sake or because nature is just stupid. They're serving the most essential purposes of opposing in us those dispositions of self-centeredness and selfishness, isolation, forgetfulness of God, that is a result largely, or most of all, of our lack of evolution on the levels of consciousness. So as those levels begin to stabilize, like intuitive, unitive, and unity itself, and beyond that, there's no limit to the growth that is possible in a life and love that is infinite. Okay. No limit to new insights into reality. But anyway, we won't leave behind the wonderful relationships we had on earth or our loved ones, but we'll be seeing them through the eyes of God, in whom they are much more beautiful than we could ever see them. And so this is a win-win situation, but the condition is tough. Not because it's that. Why can't you say, well, I'm nothing, so what? I'm happy. It's not that easy. Are you really willing to accept what happens as it is? You have to do something about it. Death is really, to accept death is to accept God, because it's the way to become no thing, no attachment to any of our roles, history, accomplishments, even loved ones. The person on the edge of death doesn't stop loving his loved ones, but sees them from a new point, and is absorbed in moving to a new level of perception. that sees everyone in God and God in everyone else, including ourselves. So it's not so much physical penance that matters. It's the humility that is willing to be nothing. And so Jesus says in that saying, anyone who brings themselves to nothing, no thing, any possessive attitude involves possessiveness in some degree. So it's the willingness to let everything go. To love everything is God's gift, but also to let it all go as God's greater gift in order to enter the world that is, and is continuously going to become more and more whatever that plan might be. So, centering prayer, dear folks, is a distinct choice of becoming nothing. Because that's all you do in centering prayer, is not to think, not to do, but just to be. Well, of course, habits of a lifetime keep sending up thoughts and feelings, and our concerns from everyday life keep intruding. So, you might say that centering prayer is itself a process that leads to unity with God. If you keep doing it, and if you are detached from experiences of God, or even from the method, at some point you have to let your word or your breath, because you're in the house of God anyway, you don't have to say anything or do anything. You're already there. You'd have to do those things in the beginning because you're always doing something else. So you reprogram yourself. But you have to go beyond all the programming, all the methods, and just be. And be what? No thing. That is, no object and no subject, but just being. This is as close as you can get to God, because this is what He does, apparently. So if you sit down to do this practice, you really are changing your life in the sense of your dispositions and your reasons for living, and the way that you treat others that might need to stand improvement. Because the thing that is most important about everybody else is God dwells in them too. And they're in this house, and we have the same source and destiny, and basically the same almost infinite needs. Our capacity. What is a capacity? It's complete openness to whatever you want to put in it. And so if it's a doggy bag, well, don't have the doggy in there if you want to have something be filled with grace. So the centering prayer then, if you continue doing so, and perhaps as you have time and are a little older, increase a little bit the time that you spend at being nothing, or just being. It doesn't mean completely nothing. It's not about annihilation, although some mystics speak of that, but annihilation kind of frightens most people today. Nothing to be afraid of. You'd be better off. Being nothing is the edge of being everything. Because once you really detached from your subjective or objective relationships with objects, you can move to being in relationship with being, and this is really who we are. We're being too, in the sense of becoming. And so the dispositions that go with centering prayer are based on the structure of the practice, which starts with external silence. When you stop thinking, at least intentionally, you're into solitude. Because if you're still thinking, your mind is cluttered with all kinds of things. It could be noisier than if you were downtown Manhattan or someplace. So silence moves, I'm talking about dispositions now, into solitude, which moves into stillness. Now stillness is on the edge of contemplative prayer. And this is, as John of the Cross says, is the inflowing of the ultimate reality into our souls. It's not us who do this. That's why contemplative prayer is always looked at as a gift, but unfortunately people think, well, it's a big gift, it's hard to get. But it isn't. It's actually something that's a gift that has been given, so that just by being human one has this capacity. So much so that some mystics today are saying that contemplation is the natural state for human beings. That is to say, to be aware of the house that they're in. The presence of God has many different words to describe it because it's infinite. So the beloved then is dealing with us at every moment exactly where we are, so we have to start there too and deal with God as exactly as we are now. But we don't know how to do that without the gradual enlightenment of our conscience, so that we see the obstacles in us or our overly animal failure to evolve. So we're still responding. Violence is a classical example of an animal reaction to conflict, but it's not the human reaction. People just haven't grown up enough to be able to handle that, where the answer to violence is forgiveness, compassion, and to do more to heal the wounds in ourselves that hinder love, rather than trying to correct something. Obviously, there's some situations that are still so animal on the social level, you have to do something to restrain some of the more animal folks. But we could probably help even mental people or criminals if we worked a little harder on our own loving, whatever in us hinders infinite compassion, okay, or the mercy that we know we have received and are receiving. Okay. Well, anyway, as these dispositions stabilize, they change you, so that at some point you may not recognize who you were as a young person or an adolescent, and there's no inclination to do so, because you're climbing out with God's help, or the Spirit is doing this for you, and so the consent begins to turn into surrender, and surrender can turn into union and unity. Each of these is a separate state of consciousness beyond rationality. So once again, you sit down and you choose to let go of yourself into the presence of God, with whatever insight you have into your own weaknesses that tend to become clearer as you gain humility and practice and confidence in God. So at a certain point, if you try to anticipate the future, we could be a little discouraged because we know we're not there yet. But all you have to do is be where you are and cultivate those things that are appropriate, and some discipline, some practice is important. But it should be congruent with our duties and daily life and so on. And it's not that hard. But we've been taught from the beginning of life that it's very hard or practically impossible. Or you have to go to a monastery to get a good start on this, or you have to give up this or that. That's not the issue, because you can do all of those things for the wrong motive, for a motive of self-accomplishment as an ascetic, for instance, or to be a great contemplative. And in any case, Christ says he's taken away all our sins, so they're not an issue once you regret them and are sorry. And we don't have the power to change unto ourselves, so we have to turn ourselves over to him. There's a few sayings in the gospel that suggest this. And remember when Christ, was it the time he cried over Jerusalem, he said, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who slay the prophets. How often, how much I long to take you to myself as a hen," notice the feminine image here, "gathers her chicks under her wings." In other words, he's prepared to mother us if only we're not something else than a little chick or something very insignificant. Yeah, so as I said, this to complete the stages, you might say, that some of them are reflected in the contemplative outreach logo, but silence, solitude, stillness. Then what comes? Solidarity. Solidarity, meaning if you do those first three, you begin to see your oneness with everyone else, and that everyone is equal, basically, and that competition, maybe apart from making a living, is absurd, because we all have the same problems, and we need to help each other get out of the swamp of human failure to evolve into fully human dispositions, and to keep regressing in temptation or crisis to purely animal responses to conflict. So as I think I said last year, the cross is the symbol of the human condition, crucified between heaven and earth, in the sense that here we are with our human consciousness. We can't go back to the irresponsibility of the animals. We know we're responsible for certain choices, and we can't go forward into this life of grace and transformation on our own strength. So to accept that situation is itself an enormous worship of God, an acceptance of God, acceptance of his plan, and a huge leap forward in the spiritual journey, to be able to accept our slice of the human condition, which is, up till now, the failure to evolve fully into rational consciousness, which I suspect can only be done if you move on to intuitive and unitive states, so that you can see the limitations of rationality, even while you admire its extraordinary capacities that we see in the technological age in a special way. So after solidarity comes service. Now the service is coming not from some ego trip or some emotional involvement in however good these are as a starting point. But now they're arising from a spontaneous disposition that invites us practically to respond to the needs of our neighbor, or to say what would be helpful in a certain situation that we might not have thought about it. In other words, we're sufficiently aware of our insertion in the house and our union with God that even our ordinary diverse activities on the humble levels of human existence are inspired, are beginning to be. And so God is experiencing the triumph of changing matter itself into divine love in our persons. So God has a huge stake in this. And any response is going to bring his help and skill to completing the work. And what would be the completion? Well, beyond surface that's inspired by the love of God, which is the fulfillment of the second commandment of the Old Testament, to love your neighbor as yourself, and raised to a higher level of intensity, but Christ's example in which he said, love one another as I have loved you, which is complete. And then might come simplicity, which is the union of prayer and action, so that even in enormous activity and distraction and concern, you never forget you're in the house. In other words, the house or the womb, if we're using that metaphor, are so much a part of our consciousness that the two begin to go on at the same time. So you never lose the presence, and the presence is always inviting us into the heart and to allow all our actions to come from love of neighbor or from divine love. And simplicity is the union of contemplation and action, and it's the way God's nature is. So it's to become God-like, to be able to be at rest and in immense activity for the love of God at the same time. Because this is what God is doing all the time. And then simplicity finally is invited to become unity, which is to be God. Not obviously in the sense of numerically one with God's almighty power, but to be one, I guess, psychologically and spiritually, so there's no remembrance of being anything but God. One is acknowledged being a creature, that's all it was asked. And when you fully can do that, then God wants you perhaps to forget even that. So in taking the path of self-surrender through a practice like centering prayer, you are courageously and taking a path that is not exactly a free way or a through way, but which is the way to divine union. No self in the sense of attachment. So the Spirit prompts us then to be what He is, or she is, or it is. There are no genders in regard to the Spirit as far as I know. And this is teaching us or assimilating us to the divine way of acting. And these are expressed in the fruits, gifts of the Spirit, and the Beatitudes. And an increased joy in the sacrifice of giving ourselves to God.